But before you start, I'm going to say a couple things about Chris that you may already know. Chris Leighton is the founding director of the Institute for Islamic Christian Jewish Studies in Baltimore, where he worked for 33 years. He's an ordained Presbyterian minister, and he served as adjunct professor at St. Mary's Seminary and University, Johns Hopkins University, and Gilman School. A sacred argument is an instance when the author of a book is uniquely qualified to write it. One reviewer has said, "This is a book about religion in the public square and the necessity of not just friendship, but serious conversation between people of religious differences." This is what Leighton means by sacred argument. His book is full of theological subtleties and dialogues, missteps, even insults, and most of all, invaluable institutional memory. This is something that Chris writes early on. What remains to be seen is whether our religious communities can embolden us to step outside our respective sanctuaries and engage religious and political strangers face to face in a sacred argument. In this broader public expanse, he continues, we discover who we and our communities really are. We will step on each other's toes. We'll make offensive blunders. That fact does not justify our retreat into safe and separate enclaves, avoiding the upheaval and confusion that comes when we see the world through the eyes of others. Chris, we are so glad to have you here.
Thank you, David. I don't have this plugged in. Is that all right?
You can use this if you want.
Okay. I want to make sure you can hear me. Am I coming through loud and clear? Good. A little louder.
You want to wear this one? It's really loud.
Figure out what to do after I finish.
I'll get the handheld one.
Okay, I've got this one.
Yeah, there's that. It's just like the Tonight Show or Oprah. All this, we're totally prepared.
All right. Good. I think you can hear me now, can't you? Well, thank you, David. Always a treat to be with you, and one of my favorite people with whom to study texts. And it is a great honor to be here at the Church of the Redeemer. It's a place that carries a very precious legacy. For it was this community that gave substance and character to a daring interreligious quest. The almost preposterous ambition to disarm centuries of distrust and hostility, ignorance, and indifference between Christians and Jews. At that time, we had not been enlightened enough to engage Islam. That was to come. But it was under the leadership of your Reverend Bob Patterson and his beloved colleagues, Rabbi Mark Loeb and Bishop Frank Murphy, all three of blessed memory, that the Church of the Redeemer hosted dialogue groups, leadership forums, and public events that truly changed the religious landscape of Baltimore and regions beyond. And leaders of this congregation, including Donna Lee Frisch and Bob Harvey, were pivotal in the formation of the Institute for what is now the Islamic Christian and Jewish Studies. Now, the skills and sensitivities required to dispel misunderstandings that are baked into the Christian culture, Western civilization actually, they may surprise you. And this place bears witness to beautiful blunders as well as transformative discoveries. On one occasion, in conjunction with preparations for the 9th National Workshop on Jewish-Christian Relations that was held in Baltimore back in 1987, with some 1,200 people across North America in attendance, during a particular evening event, There were notable speakers and dignitaries, and naturally, some of the key corporate leaders in the area. They were all present. The honor of concluding the evening was assigned to a prominent executive whose dedication to his Christian community ran deep, even if his academic prowess in the field of Jewish-Christian relations was rather thin. Well, this fellow clearly enjoyed the proceedings of the evening, not least the open bar. And so when it came time for him to give the closing benediction, he was feeling no pain. He delivered his prayer with great gusto, and immediately following his benediction, one of the guests ran up to this gentleman, awestruck, and said, "I always knew you were a brilliant businessman, but I had no idea you were fluent in Hebrew." Evidently, with the right lubricants and a noble cause, the Church of the Redeemer is a place where people can speak in tongues. Well, tonight I would like to honor the memory of Bob Patterson, Mark Loeb, and Frank Murphy by having a disruptive and challenging conversation with you. I want to address a question that has haunted me for more than 45 years and still keeps me tossing and turning at night. How can it be that the great religions of the world, all of them espousing the imperative to love one another, to welcome the stranger, to cherish peace and uphold justice, how can it be that these very same religions have time and time again inflamed hostilities, valorized violence, and stained our fragile world with so much bloodshed? How can a religion that proclaims love be twisted and put in the service of hate? The problem, of course, is not unique to Christianity. Every religious community, as best as I can tell, is forged in the fires of conflict, and each emerges from overheated struggles with an identity built on a critical distinction, a separation that differentiates insiders over and against outsiders, of them and an us. This division all too often turns malevolent when the conditions are inflamed by distrust and hostility, and when an overlay of theology leads us to think ourselves as the good guys, the children of light, pitted against the bad guys, the children of darkness. We see this among Jewish zealots, Israeli zealots who seek to expel Palestinians from the occupied territories in Gaza today, and among Muslim extremists at war with the infidel. But I will leave it to my Jewish and Muslim colleagues to excavate their own challenges. My task this evening is to rigorously examine my own tradition and demonstrate the complexity as well as the urgency confronting our own version of religious supremacy, most especially the arduous task of disarming anti-Judaism. For this is the reality that is routinely ignored by pundits today. The anti-Semitism that is roiling our college campuses and reverberating around this country and countries around the world, and has increased dramatically over the last few decades especially. This reality has religious roots, most especially within the Christian tradition. I hope to show that the difficulty is not confined to Christian fundamentalists or evangelical warriors who insist that you are damned if you do not proclaim Jesus as your Lord and Savior, or worse, regard the former president as a messianic superhero who can save America and make it great again. To be sure, all within these camps are disposed to embrace an ideology of exclusion that leads to theological and political intolerance, paving the way to violence. But I want to dig deeper and expose a challenge that implicates nearly all of us within the Christian family. And I will do this by tracing a disposition known as Christian supersessionism, a term taken from the Latin word meaning to sit above or to sit upon, and designates the traditional claim that Christians, the people of the New Covenant, have replaced the Jews, the people of the Old Covenant. Now, if I can get this to work, I'll show you the text from which this is taken. Well, here we go. Okay. The idea is most succinctly expressed in the Epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 8, verse 13. Quote, "In speaking of a new covenant, he," meaning God, "has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and growing old will soon disappear." The eminent English historian Arnold Toynbee built upon this assertion by declaring, "With the emergence of Christianity, Judaism became a fossilized religion, a relic that has lost its energetic relevance." This notion has frequently given a more punitive rendering based on the claim that God has rejected his people, the Jews, because they committed the heinous sin of rejecting his son, Jesus. It is this judgment that underwrites what another British historian and scholar, the Cambridge professor Robert Wistrick, calls the longest hatred. The rivalry between Christians and Jews during the first centuries of the Common Era evolved into a lethal obsession and ordains a prejudice validated in church and state legislation that marginalizes and demeans the Jewish people. And even a cursory survey of the ecclesiastical codes demonstrate that the Nuremberg laws established during the Nazi era were not nearly as original as we so often imagine. David Nirenberg, a distinguished professor at the University of Chicago, traces this pathology through an exhaustive study and concludes, "Anti-Judaism should not be understood as some archaic or irrational closet in the vast edifices of Western thought. It is rather one of the basic tools with which the edifice was constructed." Now, I don't know how this registers in your imagination, but my initial reaction was total denial. I had difficulty believing that I had been infected with this prejudice. It was a pathology that had stricken evangelical zealots and uneducated chuckleheads. But me, a newly ordained chaplain at the Gilman School, schooled to regard repression as the highest virtue, well, maybe cleanliness was the highest virtue, but right up there, I came very reluctantly to the realization that my tradition had cracks and flaws that I simply could not ignore, that the teachings of contempt were in the air I breathed and had seeped into my bones. It was with considerable resistance that I discovered that we Christians have all been exposed and in all likelihood are carriers of supersessionist attitudes. So in my remaining time, I'd like to provide 3 illustrations to demonstrate the extent to which this ideological bias is etched into the Christian tradition. I want to highlight some sacred texts from the New Testament. I then want to direct your attention to some of our most celebrated music, and then I want to conclude by looking at a Christian icon. The first source of the problem is rooted in our sacred scriptures, most notably the New Testament. As you know, the Bible is brimming with polemical literature, which is to say, arguments that elevate one community over and against its neighbors and their competing ways of life. The earlier followers of Jesus are beset, you see, by a major scandal. Jesus was a Jew, and so were his earliest followers. So why did the vast majority of Jews at the time refuse to recognize him as the Messiah? Well, from a traditional Jewish perspective, the job description of the Messiah is to inaugurate an era of global peace. That certainly did not materialize, and the one who claimed that the kingdom of God was upon us, well, he ended up dying ignominiously on a cross. The New Testament is therefore written at least in part to respond to this theological conundrum. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the stories leading up to the crucifixion. Take what may be the most noxious moment in the New Testament from the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is brought before the Roman procurator, Pilate, a figure portrayed as feckless, indecisive, and easily manipulated. You'll have to tell me if I land on the right slide here. Okay, good. I hasten to add that Pontius Pilate was removed from his office for excessive brutality, according to the first century Jewish historian Josephus. But the pivot point in the narrative arrives when Pilate asks the crowd of Jews, "What should be done with Jesus?" And the Jewish rabble answers, "His blood be on us and on our children." This cry echoes down the corridors of our history and serves as the basis of the deicide charge, the accusation that the Jews were responsible for the attempted murder of God. This portrait of the Jews is reinforced in other New Testament texts, such as John 8:43 and 44, where Jesus responds to his critics, who are simply identified as the Jews, with these words: "Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot accept my word. You are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies." This blistering rhetoric may have been a common trope in ancient times, but the verbal attack is taken quite literally in subsequent centuries and aligns the Jewish people with a global conspiracy to take over the world and destroy Western civilization. All of this is to say that the Christians are routinely treated to polemical assaults on the Jews in virtue of hearing segments of the New Testament, and I mean significant segments. We can only neutralize this bias by recognizing and reckoning with the fact that the New Testament is more often than not read and interpreted in ways that perpetuate Christian supersessionism and disarming the linguistic habits woven into our holy books. This is a wrenching ordeal. My second example comes from what is arguably my favorite Advent hymn, O Come, Emmanuel, and I've asked my dear friend Henry Lowe, no stranger to Redeemer, having held court here for quite some time, to play the first stanza, and you're all invited to sing along if you care to. We'll just do the first stanza, and then I'll look at the second. Henry, let it rip. David, do you have a good voice? Do you have a good voice?
It's okay.
Yeah. Why don't you? Because I have a terrible voice. Thank you, Henry. I didn't hear a whole lot of music coming from the rest of you slackers out there. But the words make it very clear. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. This isn't necessarily the second stanza, and some hymnals don't include this, but this was a common stanza. O come, thou rod of Jesse, free thine own from Satan's tyranny, and from the depths of hell thy people save, and give them victory o'er the grave. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Now, just to be clear, I am not in favor of canceling this beloved hymn. I cannot imagine celebrating the Christmas season without listening and singing this plaintive song. Yet the hymn does paint a picture of Israel and, by extension, the Jewish people that is deeply troubling. It is as though Israel is caught in the clutches of despair, lost and hopeless until Christ comes to liberate them from the depths of hell. The old covenant between God and the Jewish people is memorialized here as a dead end. Now, one strategy to neutralize the supersessionist thrust of this hymn is to see Israel as a category that includes Gentiles as well as Jews, indeed all of humanity, all of us awaiting the arrival of a Savior. But even this interpretation takes the Jewish people and fits them squarely within a Christian narrative. Jews and Judaism still come off as insufficient, incomplete, and spiritually bankrupt. So I sing this song, but I sing it with an aching heart, for it reminds me that there is an enduring need to wrestle with our tradition, a need to enter into a sacred argument with our ancestors in the unending process of listening more deeply, attuned on some mysterious level to the hearts and minds of our religious neighbors, especially our Jewish friends. My third example of the struggle with supersessionism comes from the encounter with a remarkable icon entitled Captive Daughter of Zion by the Franciscan brother Robert Lentz. The commentary that accompanies this sacred image notes, if Mary had lived in Nazi Germany, Mary would have been thrown into a concentration camp with other members of her race. Jewish Mary is the archetype of the Christian church, a church that stood silently while her people were being exterminated. This icon is an act of repentance for Christian indifference then and now. So as you can see, she's surrounded by barbed wire. Mary wears the yellow Star of David used to identify and stigmatize Jews, while Jesus is wrapped in a prayer shawl and holding a Torah scroll. The icon is intended to serve as evidence of a spiritual and ethical transformation, an admonition to never again stand by in silence. It is an expression of solidarity intended to bind Christians and Jews to a common ancestry and evoke a sense of a shared identity, a shared destiny. My first reaction was here at long last is an example of an aesthetic and ethical courage that honestly confronts the legacy of anti-Judaism and Christian supersessionism. This work turns the theological aesthetics of the Christian tradition totally on its head. You can see this by contrasting the more archetypal statues on the Strasbourg Cathedral as well as other European cathedrals. I don't think I need to decode this, but you can see the synagogue is blindfolded, her staff is broken, and her book is falling. And over and against is the sublime portrait of the church. Here's another example. Well, instead of using images to separate and elevate Christianity above Judaism, the icon here erases the boundary. This conflation signals an aesthetic reversal, one that blends and then binds the two traditions into one. The destiny of Christians and Jews is portrayed as intertwined and inseparable. And yet, this artistic expression of repentance also raises some unsettling questions, which only came into focus for me when I examined this work with some of my Jewish colleagues. They set me to wondering, does the image provide yet another example of Christians expropriating Jewish symbols and laying claim to a history that actually does not belong to them? Does the icon unwittingly falsify history in its representation of Mary, who in traditional Roman Catholic teachings is known as the Ark of the Covenant, and by extension, the Church? The icon raises the fundamental question: on which side of the barbed wire are Mary and Jesus and their followers actually located? Does a supersessionist bias remain intact by envisioning the church, symbolized by Mary, who not only surrounds but encompasses and envelops the Jewish child and the Torah scrolls? More egregiously, does the icon transmute Mary and Jesus into Jewish martyrs and suggest that the death of Jews can be fitted into a Christian paradigm and read as a mysterious, redemptive sacrifice for the good of all humankind? Just as Jesus had to die to atone for the sins of the world, so too the Jews should be seen as sacrificial victims. Well, if this is too much of a stretch for you, does not the icon, at the very least, declare that the true church is also a victim of the Nazi regime alongside the Jewish people? Does the icon obscure the fact that the vast majority of individuals who greased the machinery of death, those folks were baptized Christians? What the artist intends as a means to deepen and expand our powers of empathy may, in the language of James Baldwin, only perfume the carnage. No matter how you cut it, this icon can be read and interpreted in different ways, and even with the resolve to counter the legacy of Christian supersessionism, our best intentions may fall short. Now, I could easily expand this catalog of examples, and I do in the book, to demonstrate that the problem of Christian supersessionism and the persistence of anti-Judaism are etched deeply into the Christian tradition. And you might conclude that I have turned the good news of the gospel into very bad news indeed. If this dysfunctional pattern of building a religious identity is so ingrained, why, might you ask, remain a Christian? Who wants to pitch their tent in a tradition that breeds contempt for its neighbors? Why not walk away, as so many people, especially the young and increasingly well-educated, are doing? I think of the challenge this way. Is someone who raised and loved you, got infirm, and displayed destructive tendencies, would you give up and wash your hands of their disabilities and run for the exit? And by extension, would you abandon the very one who taught you the rudiments of fidelity, the wonders of beauty, the majesty of song and story, the ethical imperative to put others ahead of yourself, the theological discipline of worship that gives scale and dimension to our lives? Even if I wanted to, and I must admit I sometimes do, I simply could not cut myself off from the limb on which I sit. The church, with all its imperfections, remains my family. It is the place I call home. The challenge brings to mind an axiom of one of the finest teachers I ever met, whose daughter's here today, namely Jerry Downs. He once told a group of Gilman parents, the time when your religious community, he didn't put it in these terms, I'm messing around here a little bit, but the time when your religious community needs your love the most is when it is most unlovable. Rabbi Joel Zaman, my friend of blessed memory, put the matter another way. If you give up and refuse to engage your tradition, with whom are you going to argue? Who's going to challenge you? Who's going to pull you out of your self-satisfied complacency and feed you anything better than the gruel that's dished out by our current culture? Why in the world would you deprive yourselves of the opportunity to wrestle with the rascals and the angels, the sinners and the saints who lived in different times and places? These rambunctious ancestors, they're your best instructors. Even when they are wrong, they remain your family. For all their warts and wrinkles, they're the ones who can instruct you in the art of sacred argumentation. And frankly, you owe it to them to pay a mighty debt. You may not be guilty of their flaws and foibles, but you sure are responsible. In grappling with this deep and enduring legacy, I increasingly turn to James Baldwin, who made the following observation. No one is more dangerous than he who imagines himself pure in heart, for his purity by definition is unassailable. People who imagine the history flatters them are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin and become incapable of seeing or changing themselves or the world. Our most precious and holy treasures, our Bible, our music and art, the church fathers and mothers, our theologies and liturgies, our sacred rituals and prayers, all are conduits that can disclose the presence of the divine. They are holy treasure, but they also bear our fallible imprints. They come to us unfinished. The traditions we inhabit and all the goodness and beauty within them are always and everywhere in need of revision and refinement, sanctification. Like every inheritance, without our ongoing care and attention, they become empty vessels, empty ruins. Our traditions, just like our communities, are dynamic and living, which is another way of saying they are always changing. We are invited into the noble and holy labor of doing all in our power to make sure that what we hand to our children and our grandchildren is better and more truthful and more beautiful than what we ourselves were given. Change, you see, is not the enemy of continuity, but its necessary complement. Contrary to those who would eliminate anything in the curriculum that makes us uncomfortable, anything that exposes our fallibility, an honest encounter with the heritage, our heritage, the one entrusted to us, that will prove disruptive and humbling. The sacred heritage we have inherited puts demands on us and blesses us when we take on this monumental responsibility. I do not believe for a moment that we can escape a sacred argument with our ancestors and our contemporaries, by the way. But it is in this reckoning with the past and with one another here and now that we discover God in our midst and can make our own contributions in the work of redemption. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And the way we structured the evening is Chris and I have a minute or two for a little bit of dialogue, but I want to invite you, as we're talking, to be coming up with questions that you might have for Chris, because our little time will go by quickly, and I know you have things to offer. So just be ready, and when we get to that point, I'll run down and make sure the microphone is on. Chris, thank you. I guess I'm mostly moved by the palpable pain that it clearly is the at least some of the ground from which you are speaking and studying, and so I want to begin by just thanking you for sharing that. Arguably, the ICJS is a response to some of the pain that you have articulated. You know, an organization whose lifeblood has been to invite people from different religious backgrounds to come together and wrestle. And surely a piece of that wrestling has been, you know, someone in the room saying, well, you know, God loves you, but I think I'm his favorite, or something along those lines, right? Some kind of supersessionism. And so I'm wondering can you just share a bit of the genesis of that particular response to to, you know, the I would imagine some pain that gave birth to what is now ICJS.
Yeah, I just don't think there's any way around discomfort. I'm one of these characters that needed to be whacked upside the head before much of anything penetrated. And there was an event that took place. Charlie Obrecht will be able to flesh this out in even more detail. There was an event that was held in Baltimore when I first arrived at Gilman. He came in and said, why don't we have a program on the Holocaust? And I said, well, why would we want to do that? That sounds painful. And he said, because he's of the conviction, as are a number of scholars, that Western culture, Western civilization was radically transformed by the Holocaust insofar as it exposed the failures of our educational system, that our schools were capable of turning out technically competent barbarians who would do anything as long as the price was right. And the question that was being posed was, our schools today, are they doing any better? Are they cultivating are they calibrating a moral compass that will allow us to steer our country so that it deals with hardship and the disenfranchised, the poor in our midst, the stranger who needs a helping hand, the immigrant? The second credibility crisis that Charlie named was that the Holocaust took place in the very heartland of Christendom. And how could it be that baptized Christians were responsible for this murderous, systematic assault on the Jewish people? On both counts, our civilization has been rocked to the core, and we've got to contend with it. Well, we did this program, and it was life-changing. So in many respects, I have Charlie to blame for taking me or leading me down this questionable, winding path. And Peggy was also nudging me along the way, too. So I think that almost all the participants in those early stages of study were utterly shocked to deal with the reality that I've tried to, in an abbreviated fashion, describe for you today. We spent 3 years examining what were the factors that led Christians and Jews to part company, and how did this antipathy evolve and metastasize over the centuries. And at the end of those 3 years, when the ICJS said, we're going to go out of business. We did what we said we were going to do. We hopefully raised consciousness. We had 200 clergy from 10 different denominations studying, and almost to a person they said, you cannot stop now. You cannot leave the theological challenge to our denominations because we're all locked into survival mode and we're concerned about how are we going to fill the pews. We simply cannot tackle an issue that's going to be this painful and this disruptive. And therefore, it falls on the ICJS to move ahead. And fortunately, we had a board and we had a community that stood up and said, we're going to make this happen. We are going to continue the work. And the demand continued to grow and expand and was, quite frankly, breathtaking. And I've been up in Maine, ladies and gentlemen, now for about 4 years solid. And I think that you have no idea what a precious treasure you have in our midst. Certainly the Church of the Redeemer is one of the great gems of Baltimore. But, but the ICJS, under the leadership of Dr. Heather Rubens, is doing extraordinary work and carrying the challenges to a whole new level. And it is a place where hard questions are asked, where struggle is part of the daily diet, and where there is pain, but in a curious way, where there's also elation. And the elation and the joy that comes from seeing and recognize that the world is bigger and more wondrous than we ever had any idea.
Yep. It makes me think, Chris, as you're speaking, a piece of one way I kind of experience your articulation of the trouble, the pain, the wrongness of the tradition that raised you, is in a sense waking up to the fact that my family is not well. Yeah. And I've never known a family that was happy to have someone in it say, we're not well. And yet, that's often a piece of truth. I grew up in Arkansas in the Bible Belt in a context which was, on the face of it, very religious. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about how I knew that so much of what surrounded me beyond really the theological discussions in my house was poison. was just absolutely poison. I was told with no, attempt to sort of hide it that, Jews, oh my God, let's talk about Catholics, let's talk about Methodists. And I would say I was an Episcopalian, and they'd kind of go, well, that sounds bad too. Right? It was simply a given that there was one way to articulate truth. The word salvation was bandied about, right? And I knew, this is, I guess, been part of my kind of life's work. I knew that we were not all condemned. I knew, in fact, that we were all deeply loved and embraced. And so my question for my professional life has been, what is it within a person or within a system that can realize what I'm hearing, the powers that be around me, the status quo is wrong, is perverse, is bent. And where is my safe harbor, or what's my toehold, or where's the truth I can stand on? Because just as back in my first example of a family, if you just announce you're wrong, you're perverse, you're bent, survey says the powers that be don't really like hearing that, right? So I wonder, I guess, about as you encountered, these greats, right here in Baltimore. Was there common ground that you heard about how they knew that something that connected us, something that was common, was right? I mean, I hate to use language of right and wrong, but was good and healthful and life-giving, and other words and structures were not.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. It was, if I had to give advice to seminarians who were about to go into a congregation, I would encourage them to have their first phone call be to the local rabbi, inviting them out for lunch, or it could be the local imam. But the value of having somebody outside your tradition help you see, help you feel what it is to be on the margins is indispensable. And it is, there's no getting around how hard it is to have that reckoning. I don't want to sugarcoat this in any respect. Another story came to mind that I think was quite formative for me. When I became the chaplain at Gilman, the local presbytery wanted to know whether this was a legitimate undertaking. And so I was invited into a room where there were these stuffy, we're the Presbyterian tribe, we like to do things decently in order. And I was surrounded by a staid and stolid group of clerics who interrogated me about what I was going to do at the Gilman School. And there was a minister who had a great baritone voice, and he could make his presence known. Well, he said, from my understanding, the Christian presence at the Gilman School has been diluted with the influx of Jews. And my response, and normally I think of some witty comeback just before I fall asleep, but the Holy Spirit might have been at work here, because I looked him in the eye and I said, if the Christian presence is so fragile, it cannot withstand the presence of Jews, it is a faith that needs to be shattered. Now, But it turns out that when we began the ICGS, there were a number of people who came to the table who would have echoed or mirrored that kind of disposition. And in point of fact, as I look back, I think how judgmental I was at that moment, and that I could have been more understanding about a deeper question about how do you hold fast to a religious tradition in a pluralistic, diverse audience with a student body how do you keep a core grounding in a respective tradition? That's a good question.
It is, and I heard that in your sense of, you know, the real moment of truth is to hang in there when the system, the group that's raised you is suffering the most, and perhaps, you know, an easy moment to walk away. Stay in.
Yep.
Stay in. And my experience of the people that come to this place is they're in deep. They care deeply about what it is that the revelation that we call Jesus has taught us, and continues to say, and you know, we've got these lively groups of people every week that gather in small groups and really interrogate on some level themselves, but the frame is, let's really look at this piece of scripture and what's it saying, and what do you hear now, and what strikes you, and if what strikes you is something that's quite troubling to admit, all the better for our conversation. I want to open this up because I know y'all have thoughts and questions. Can I bring the microphone to you? Yeah. I'm going to leave you, Chris, for a second.
Recently, or in the past couple of years, we've gone through sacred ground here, and I had such a realization about white privilege and how much I had that I didn't know I had. No. And when you started to define and describe supersessionism, I thought, white privilege, Christian privilege. So is this like white privilege?
Yeah, I think there's probably a similar kind of disruption that takes place when we see ourselves clearly in the mirror. You know, sometimes we have a hard time putting down the mirror. The older I get, I don't have as much trouble putting down the mirror these days, but in any case, it can be rude to see how many wrinkles and warts we have. And that discovery can take place, of course, when we examine the ways in which we are enculturated into a world deeply stained with racism and Islamophobia, as well as anti-Judaism. But the excitement of discovery, if this came off as really all gloomy, I apologize, because it's not. I mean, it is a really exciting adventure to really grab hold of a tradition and wrestle with it, wrestle it to the ground.
Thank you, Chris. Is it our responsibility, or what would you say our response should be as Christians when we see Christianity being used in destructive ways in our government, for example, picking favorites and saying only Christians of this type shall hold office, or only Christians of this type shall be allowed to, in some ways our government picking favorites and picking a certain sect within Christianity? Is it us as Christians of other sects, is it our responsibility to speak out? Who would speak out and say, that's not the Christianity we know? What's your suggestion with what we face, given what we're seeing?
Well, the reality of white Christian nationalism, or to some degree just Christian nationalism, because some of the leaders don't fall into the category of being white, but Christian nationalism, efforts to establish the U.S. as a Christian nation, and therefore marginalize non-Christians as second-class citizens or kind of guests in the nation, or what in the Islam would be called dhimmis. I think we've got to call it out. And again, the ICJS is doing bold and daring work to name just how dangerous and dysfunctional this Christian nationalism is. And I mean, there's all kinds of peculiar characteristics of this complicated movement. I think Matt Taylor, there are a number of presentations that he has done that could be checked out on the ICJS website if you wanted to dig more deeply into this. But this is an issue that Heather and other folks at the ICJS are tackling on a daily basis. I think it's a huge challenge, because I really fear that our nation is drifting in a direction that will render it unrecognizable.
Backing up for a bit to Hitler and his incredible malfeasance to the Jews, I'd like to recommend a book. Can I be heard? On a slightly lighter note, but still serious. A little booklet, you can still get it on Amazon, called The Last Man in Hell, and by Stephen Vicchio. And it's Ivan and Adolf. And we go through. There's a black cleaning lady who comes and tidies up around all these prisoners in hell, and eventually to get them to come to their senses and move on. I'm cutting this really short. So time after time, one person comes to a realization, he goes. Another person, he goes. Bob Ursay was in there, he goes. But it keeps on going until the last two men in hell are Ivan and Adolf. And eventually one of them, I won't ruin it for you, it's a very short book, but one of them finally comes to his senses and realizes that he's committed unpardonable sins. And then the cleaning lady, who obviously is much more important than a cleaning lady, says, okay, you're released now. And he says, no, I'm not going, because who else is going to convince the last man in hell of his sins? So he stays until the last man in hell, and then the story ends. But it's a wonderful short book, but it's on a humorous level, but it confronts sin and redemption.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful little book.
Yeah.
So highly recommend.
And Stephen, of course, is a local a scholar and done some wonderful work, wonderful teacher.
Hi. The ICJS, originally, I assume, was trying to come up with some sort of common denominator. And within it, there were all folks from revealed traditions.
Yes.
It seems to me that part of what needs to happen now is to include people who do not come from revealed traditions. Yeah. And perhaps that's a way of bringing back some of the young people that are leaving.
Yeah. Again, I think this has been a real concern of the ICJS, and Heather has been very creative in thinking about ways to engage a public that oftentimes yawns when they hear the word religion or runs in the other direction. There's no getting away from religion. And frankly, I don't want to hand my tradition over to the Christian nationalists who are going to weaponize it and use it to beat the hell out of anyone who doesn't see things their way. So all the more reason why we have to reclaim and speak out. One of the things that really haunts me is I went up to Maine, and there were a lot of wonderful lobstermen nearby, and some of them have Trump signs, and yet, we can sit down and eat a lobster together and enjoy it. But the question that haunts me is, how do I engage folks who are locked into a position and are unyielding in considering that the world could look any different from another perspective? And it is one of the challenges that I confront on a regular basis. How do you have a constructive disagreement with somebody or with people who are locked into the rightness, the certainty of their own viewpoint, and simply will not imagine that life could be any other way? My position is you can't give up on them. I mean, oftentimes I just feel like I'm just wasting my breath, and and my wife can testify. I come back from these conversations, my stomach's in a knot. I'm thinking about the brilliant things that might have been said that I never could come up with, and I feel defeated. But being defeated over and over again may not be such a bad thing in the construction of a character. So I want to encourage you to join the cohorts of the frequently defeated, but the nobly inspired.
Yeah, I think I'm the first vice president of that club. So, yeah.
I think one thing that we need to understand first is the views and understanding why they have those views of the people which we tend to denigrate and to treat as, idiots. And that's a problem. There is, speaking of books, a very good book that tries to examine the rise and the adherence to the principles of the Tea Party by Arlie Hochul, called Strangers in the Land.
Yep.
And she's a liberal Berkeley sociologist who goes to a small section of Louisiana. And she, over a period of years, comes to know these people well and really gives a fair amount of insight into who these people are and why they think the way they do. And that's the first step in trying to be able to reason with anybody.
Getting to know people and engaging with them is not only the first step. Is there any other work? Is there anything else we should be doing but engaging with each other? It's not a means to an end. I think that's the end, to be engaged, to know and be known. I think again about my adolescence in Little Rock, and there weren't any people that I agreed with. And I wanted to go out with pretty girls, and I wanted to play on sports with my friends. And so it wasn't I didn't have the option of finding someone with whom I agreed. There wasn't anyone. My brother, but he went off to college. And I can honestly say the people with whom I deeply disagreed were hugely attractive to me for different reasons. If I was looking for safe harbor for my mind, I wasn't going to find it. I just wasn't going to find it. But I wanted to be engaged with them because we're human beings. And so at the time, I didn't think that was an important lesson. But I really do believe there's I don't try to do anything else but engage. I don't know that there's more.
Thanks. Well, I just wanted to say that right after October 7th, the most useful thing that came to me via email was something from ICJS. And I sent it to, my immediate family. I didn't want to be obnoxious and send it to a lot of people, but it was a suggestion that the kindest way to respond to other people was to, not barrel through and try to say what your thoughts were, but to just ask people how they were doing and listen. And I thought that was an extraordinary message, and I really appreciated ICJS for that.
Yeah, I thought it was a superb response.
It was really wonderful.
Yeah.
This, going along with that, I really appreciated everything you just said about anti-Semitism. And no but and, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the student protests.
Yeah.
As a Jew, I'm interested in that.
Yeah. You know, I'm a big advocate of protest. I think protest is a way to dig down into the depths and to give voice that goes against the grain. And college should be a place where one learns how to protest. So it would only be as a last resort that I would ever want to call in the police, and it would only be when certain lines are crossed that are violent. But I think what troubles me so much about the discourse and what's going on in our colleges right now is the thinking is binary. It's all zero-sum logic. And if one side's going to win, then the other side's got to lose. And I think the discipline of a sacred argument is exactly what is missing, which is to say, before you can even open your mouth, you better be able to accurately and empathetically articulate the position of those with whom you disagree. And after you've demonstrated you know their viewpoints and feel it in your kishkas, then you can voice your opinion. But I quite frankly, if your heart isn't broken by what's going on in Gaza, you don't have heart. It is horrible. And I have great sympathy for calling Israel's leadership to task. I'm glad that a number of military leaders are increasingly speaking out. It's easy to forget the protests that were going on in Israel just prior to 10/7, where the Netanyahu government's trying to neutralize the judiciary, so essential for a healthy democracy. Hundreds of thousands of people protesting. And therefore, I really take umbrage by the facile way in which we condemn Israel without nuancing it. What's lacking, I think, at so many colleges, they are not marshaling their resources and their faculties and their connections with the outside world to pursue the educational questions at the heart of what's going on. You need to know the history. You need to know the struggles that have gone on and shaped and misshaped and deformed the peoples who are occupying those lands. And it requires a deep dive. So from my vantage point, I would like to see our colleges and universities take up the challenge that the students are putting in their laps and to really struggle with what is at stake.
Chris,
Dolores.
would you say that all of us as humans tend to belong to some kind of a group, and we think that God is on our side,
Yeah.
is our champion, reflects our culture and our way of thinking and history, the way it works when we define it? And is that a problem universally that ICJS and others who study these problems and who reach out to bring healing have to deal with?
Yeah, again, I think that what you're naming, Dolores, is a dynamic operative in almost any religious or increasingly political entity. Lines are drawn, and there is an inner and there is an outer circle. And the question is, what can we do to make sure that we are not constructing walls that divide us from each other and give us the opportunity and the blessing that comes from being rattled into seeing the bigger picture.
I think we have time for one more question.
It's less a question than a statement. After World War II, the Allies divided up Western Germany, the French, the British, and the Americans, and they all required that German schools have a curriculum about the Holocaust. East Germany, being under the control of the Russians, did not have such a requirement. And Austria, because it was an occupied country, did not have the requirement. France was a victor, they didn't require it. England, the US. None of us did, but Germany had to learn about what anti-Semitism could lead to. And I think about the prayer that we say in church about how we've all sinned and we've all come short. We haven't loved our neighbors as ourselves. And I think part of the problem today is that we've never really struggled with the fact that anti-Semitism was ripe throughout the Western world prior to World War II and during World War II, and that allowed the Holocaust to happen. And how do we educate people today about that? Thank you.
By the way, there's a wonderful book by a Jewish philosopher named Susan Neiman. One of my favorites as a Presbyterian was her book on evil in modern thought. You know, a Presbyterian just can't resist a plunge into that kind of dark night. But wasn't it Mencken that said nothing gets a Puritan or a Presbyterian more upset than the thought that somebody somewhere is having a good time? But there's a book that Susan Neiman wrote that called Learning from the Germans. And it is an examination precisely of how the German population has come to wrestle with the question of anti-Semitism in its tradition. And then her question, she delves into this because she says, perhaps it will be instructive in guiding Americans to come to terms with their legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. So she wants to do a transfer of sensibilities. At the same time, more recently, she's been rather critical of Germans who are asking very hard questions about Israel's conduct, and argues that there is a way of being so approving of any and everything Israel does out of guilt that it refuses and fails to hold Israel accountable to moral standards. So as a Jewish scholar who is heading up the Einstein Institute in Berlin, she's ironically accused of being an anti-Semite because she's critical of the way in which Israel is prosecuting this war. Well, it's been a great honor for me to come back to be with all of you, and I just want to thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you, Chris. And you ended with the story of a wonderful book. And we have a wonderful book for sale in the narthex that Chris has written. So I commend it to you. We've got a friend from the Ivy Bookstore there if you don't already own a copy of A Sacred Argument. Thank you.
This is great fun to be with you.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah.
You too. Let me take your microphone.
Yeah.